Rob, did you just pray that everyone would listen intently? I love that. So we come to the next of the series of standing on the shoulders of giants. And the giants whose shoulders we're going to stand on tonight is a character called Rebekah. And we read about Rebekah in Genesis 24. And there is much about the story about Rebekah that we could explore, but there's just one simple thing I want to focus on this evening, and that is her character. We're going to be exploring the character of Rebekah. Before we launch into this thing about her character, I just need to give you a little bit of background. So Abraham wanted to find a suitable woman to marry his son. So he sent his servant, off on a long journey. And we read in verse 10 of Genesis 24, the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels. That's important, we'll come back to that. Loaded with all kinds of good things. And he was traveling to a specific town, and he went about 400 kilometers, and that's also important, so we'll come back to the moment. And when he arrived at this town, 400 kilometers away, we read in verse 11 that he made the camels kneel down near the well outside of the town. And he waited. And what happened was, after a while, we read that Rebekah went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. Now, the women would have been at the well because it was the coolest time of the day in the evening, and they would have all gone there at the same time. But Rebekah went down and filled her jar. And as she was walking away from the well, the servant approaches her, and he says he hurried to meet her. Verse 17, "Please," he says, "give me a little water from your jar." And we read on that what happens is Rebekah graciously responds. She lowers the jar, which would have been on her shoulder, and she pours this servant a drink. But that is not all about Rebekah. You see, clearly her eyes were open to a broader situation. She wasn't just thinking about this man. She could see that he'd been traveling a long way. Camels were quite rare in those days and probably only used for long journeys. So she could see that this man and his gathering, his party, had come on a long journey. She sees the need beyond the presenting one. She sees beyond the initial problems. And she says this to him. She says, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." She meets his need, and then she goes to the wider need. She goes the extra mile. Now, it's very important that we realize that this isn't like giving a small drink like to a dog. This is what it is like. It says in verse 20 that she ran back to the well to draw more water and drew enough for all his camels. She drew enough for all his camels. Now, this is the important thing. This is what I got from a book. I didn't do the working out myself. 10 camels, and each camel would have probably drunk 20 gallons. So that is 200 gallons of water that she went to the well, drew up, and took back to the camels. Now, just so you know, a gallon is about 8 pints. So 20 gallons is 160 pints per camel. That is a lot of water. Now, we don't know exactly how much she would have carried, but the archaeologists tell us that probably she had about 5 gallons, which actually, to carry around on your shoulder, is a lot of weight. She carried 5 gallons. And this book that I read suggested it would take about 3 minutes to carry this jar of water to the camels, to pour it out to the camels, to go back to the well, to fill up this jar, to walk back to the camels and do it again. It would have taken 40 trips. And so it would have taken her about 2 hours. I hope you can see her character coming through. This wasn't, "Yeah, I'll give you a bit of a drink and here's a cup of water for your camel." This is, I'll give you a drink and then I'm going to work very, very hard for you. I'm going to go the extra mile. I'm going to work for 2 hours at the end of a busy day so your camels can have enough to drink. Now, all of us have done good things. Some of us may have even done something as generous-spirited as Rebekah, that 2 hours of extra mile, that huge effort. But the writer of Genesis is wanting to make a really significant point here about Rebekah's character, as I said. You see, what had happened just before she feeds the camels, waters the camels, the servant prays, and he prays that God would give the right woman for his master's son. And in the eyes of the servant, the way the servant viewed it and the way he prayed was that he felt that if God answered this prayer, that God would be showing him kindness. Because, he says, that if a woman offers to water the camels, that will be a sign. And he says in verse 14, by this, if someone comes and offers to water the camels, by this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So for the servant, it was so much more than just one random woman doing a good deed. It was one random woman demonstrating the love of God to the servant. And therefore, it was God's way of showing kindness to the servant and to his master Abraham. Now, the word kindness doesn't really do it any justice in the NIV translation, because in other translations we see that this word kindness can mean unfailing love. It can mean steadfast love. It can mean gracious love. What this woman Rebekah was doing, as well as working very, very hard, was revealing her heart, and she was revealing that her heart revealed God's heart for Abraham and his people. What an incredible woman she was. The interesting thing is that we read in verse 15 that before he'd even finished praying that God would send the right woman, she arrives. It's almost as if God is answering the prayer right in that very, very moment. Rebekah's actions match exactly what the man was praying for. Someone to come and give me a drink and to feed water my camels. And therefore, as I said, it actively demonstrates God's love for Abraham and his family. What an incredible thing to do. Now, like so often, this is why we're standing on the shoulders of giants, because like so often when we see people in the Old Testament do amazing things, it's like a little glimmer of what Jesus is like. And that is often the case, whether it's Moses or Abraham or David or Joshua or Rebekah or Ruth. What they do is they give you a little picture, a little snapshot that in Jesus found its fullness, found its ultimate expression. Rebekah was a grandmother to 37 counts of Jesus, great-great-great-great-great-grandmother. And this godly, generous heart that she had, this demonstration of love that she had, we see find its ultimate expression in Jesus. So I'd like just to talk about Jesus for a bit. You know, there are many examples in the Bible of Jesus going the extra mile, not just giving the one glass of water, but watering the camels as well, metaphorically. One, for example, is when he'd finished a day's teaching and the disciples thought he was too tired to have little kids come to him. But he still said, no, let the kids come to me. I'm exhausted from my day's teaching, but I'll still hang out with these babies. Any of you teachers in the room know how that must feel when you get home at the end of the day. The last thing you want to do is hang out with more kids. What else did Jesus do? Remember the story of the Samaritan woman. Jesus had been traveling all morning. It had been the heat of the midday sun. He was tired from his journey, and yet he spends time with the Samaritan woman and ministers to her and blesses her. What about the time when he was healing great crowds and had compassion on his great crowds, even when he'd just found out that his cousin, John the Baptist, had died? Jesus demonstrates a love that humanly speaking, very few of us are ever able to match, even once. Time and again, Jesus goes the extra mile. He does something beyond what humanly speaking might be possible. Now, perhaps the most famous example of Jesus doing this is when he washed his disciples' feet in John 13. Now, not because this was as hard work as Rebekah carrying the water for the camels, but when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, it was deeply symbolic and it was deeply powerful in what it taught his disciples. And therefore, it is deeply symbolic for what it teaches us, his disciples, today. Because when Jesus washed his disciples' feet, what he was doing, he was taking on the role that should have been done by a servant. And this would have been demeaning, this would have been degrading. What did the disciples call Jesus? They called him rabbi, they called him teacher, they called him master, they called him Lord. That was all about the disciples being low and promoting Jesus, saying, we are not worthy of you. You are better than us. You are our master. You're our Lord. And yet here was their Lord lowering himself voluntarily to get down on his knees in the dirt and wash their feet. Take the role of a servant. Like Rebekah, all those hundreds of years earlier, he offers an example of true humility and true voluntary service for others. And if he, I've already said this, if he who is the greatest leader, if he is the one who we follow, if he's willing to get down in the dirt and serve in that way, then the disciples then and us as his followers today should also be willing to get down in the dirt. But of course, this wasn't just about serving. We can learn that this is about serving, but it's also about something else. It is also about demonstrating to the disciples the greatest love. And because soon after he'd washed his disciples' feet, where did he go? They left and they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane where he was arrested, and that led to his crucifixion. So in washing his disciples' feet, he was setting them a standard. He was giving them an example, but he was also saying, look, I'm now going to model for you what this really means. I'm going to humble myself and I'm going to die because I love you. And I don't just love you 12 disciples gathered here. I love the whole of creation. And this is what it really means to serve, to give up your life for those you love. And of course, because Jesus went to the cross, it's not our feet that get cleaned. It's our very souls that get cleaned. Our very inner being gets cleaned. And it's not the mess of the streets and the dust from the floor that gets washed off. It's our sin, it's our mess, it's our failures, it's our mistakes, it's our regrets. And he washes that from our body by dying on the cross for us, so that we are fully clean. Because the servant king went to the cross and washed us by doing that. Philippians 2:4-8 is just such a resonance of this. Let's look at this together. First of all, Philippians 2 verse 3. In humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but just like Rebekah did, each of us should be looking for the interests of others. It goes on, verse 5, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset, the same attitude, the same approach as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, didn't consider equality with God something to be used to his advantage, but he made himself nothing. He lowered himself, and he took the very nature of a servant in that upper room by washing the feet, but greater than that, he took the nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself not just by washing their feet, but by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross, so that I can be washed clean, So the mess that I carry, the failure that I carry, the mistakes, the regrets, I can be washed clean once and for all. This passage about Rebekah, what an incredible woman she was. And so the challenge for us all coming into this week is that we have that same mindset, as it says in Philippians, have the same mindset as Rebekah. We need to be prepared, not just to give someone a drink of water, but to water their camels as well. Don't think we'll meet any real camels in Poole, but you know what I mean. There will be people who need you to go the extra mile. That's the challenge for you this evening. But the comfort and the huge encouragement is simply this, that Jesus, the servant king, will continue to serve us in humility. And every time we feel our feet need a wash, every time we know that our very beings have messed up again, we can go to him and say, Jesus, I need you to wash me again. And because of what he did on the cross, he will take away the dirt. He will take away the mess. He will take away the shame. It says in the Bible that his mercy is new every morning. We can do this every day. And he will wash us clean.